met me before. My name is Michael Berg. I'm a professor in the psychology department. I'm glad to see you all here. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, a University Distinguished Professor of Neuroscience at Northeastern University. Dr. Barrett's a highly coveted speaker and considered one of the most influential psychologists in the field today. She's testified before Congress, presented her work to the FBI and the National Cancer Institute, and appeared on television on Very Jealous alongside Morgan Freeman and Maria Shriver.
That's the real...
That's like the coup de grace, yeah. It should come as no surprise that it's very important in Dr. Feldman's work to share research with the public. She's renowned for her countless scholarly articles and academic volumes on the nature of emotion. Her research challenges head-on some long-entrenched theories regarding the universality and uniformity of emotions. Research long overdue for re-examination. We chose her most recent book, How Emotions Are Made, for this year's Psychology Senior Seminar, and all 3 sections of the course have been having rich discussions of her arguments, supporting a new constructed view of emotion. These sessions have led us to think about how ideas take hold in any field, and the forces that reinforce and influence them, including a reflection on how key players and methodologies come to dominate a given discipline. It's made us appreciate what it takes to put forth a new idea, and the backlash that provocative theory can receive even from people one considers her friends and colleagues. Along the way, we've had some great fun learning some new emotion terms, right, from different cultures, everyone. Making up some new emotion concepts ourselves and working to increase our emotional granularity. Seniors, emotional granularity, good, we've got it with us, awesome. Given all of this and all the fun we've been having for the past 2 weeks discussing her book, it should come as no surprise that I'm personally very excited to have Dr. Barrett speaking with us today. Please join me in giving her a warm meet welcome.
Sure, I feel like a rock star for a minute. I guess that really to be a rock star, you have to have one of those ear things, right? So. Hey, no laughter. You guys are a tough audience. All right, so today, first of all, thanks so much for coming. It's awesome to be in a film room like this. I only have you for under 60 minutes. And normally a talk that I would give would be something like this. I would go over some key pieces of evidence that many people find surprising, that led me to question the kind of classical view of emotion that is very popular in our textbooks and in our culture. And then I would use that as the entree into introducing the work that I've done and the framework that we use in my lab and that many people are adopting around the world. But that entire talk takes about an hour, and I only have you for about 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 1 or 2 examples of the evidence. I'm not going to cover every single thing that could be covered. And then I'm going to jump very quickly to just an introduction to my view. And then I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to let you guys ask questions. And hopefully the rest of the information, or at least some of it, will come out that way. So how does that sound? Good. All right. So there are lots of examples of fictions in science, right? We used to believe that the sun revolved around the Earth. We used to believe that the Earth was flat. And the science of emotion has its own fictions, very nicely illustrated by this movie, Inside Out. How many of you saw Inside Out? How many of you thought it was a really fun movie? How many of you thought that it actually reflects how emotions work in the brain? Well, you know, you guys are in good company because actually the representatives from Pixar, the director, and the scientists who consulted on the film all went on record in many, many interviews saying that this represents exactly how emotions work, that this is the theory that is well supported by science. So supposedly, we all have little characters that live in our brains, one for joy, sadness, disgust, fear, and anger. And joy is the leader, because this is the United States, and we do love happiness here. I have a colleague and a friend who a motion researcher who moved here from the Netherlands 20 years ago, and she told me that for the first year that she lived here, her cheeks ached because she had never smiled so much in her entire life. So what I'm going to tell you today, what I talk about in my book and in a number of lectures, public lectures that I've given, is that after 25 years of research in my own lab, I can tell you that this is also a fiction. Now, if you wanted to learn something about physics, you would not watch a Roadrunner cartoon. You would not watch, Roadrunner run off a cliff and not fall, right? Or watch Wile E. Coyote run off a cliff and not fall until he looks down, in which case he falls. And that would be cool if actually gravity worked that way, but it doesn't. And so similarly, it would be really cool, and it would make science much easier if actually emotions were like little characters in our heads, and that each one of us in this room had those characters that were identical, like little circuits, one for each emotion, but we don't. So normally in this talk, as I said, I would take on 3 fictions in relation to the science of emotion, and kind of show how they're fictions, and then use that as a platform to discuss what I actually think is going on. But I think we're just going to, for now, we'll start with the faces, and maybe we'll get to bodies. And but what I'm going to say about any one of these domains of research actually holds for all of them. All 3 of them show exactly the same pattern of findings. So the first fiction is that emotions are displayed on the face with expressions that we recognize. People are supposed to smile when they're happy, they're supposed to scowl when they're angry, they're supposed to frown or pout when they're sad. And everyone around the world is supposed to make these expressions and also recognize smiles and scowls and pouts as expressions of emotion. But consider this evidence. So along the horizontal axis here, I'm going to present the facial configurations that have been designated as universal expressions of emotion. And along the y-axis is our proportions or percentages. And we can ask the question, how frequently do people actually make these facial configurations to express emotion? How often do people actually smile in sadness? How often do they actually scowl in anger, and so on? And the answer is not so much. So this is a meta-analysis, which is a statistical summary of studies, which calculated the average proportion of time that people actually make these facial movements during actual emotional events. And the proportion is usually greater than chance. And that little n there is the number of studies that were available to analyze. So people do scowl more than chance in instances of anger, but only about 28% of the time, which means that they're moving their faces in other ways when they're angry. And if you think about it for a minute, it's not that surprising, right? Because people can cry when they're angry. They can frown when they're angry. They can smile when they're angry. They can sit with a stone face, plotting the demise of their enemy when they are angry. Your heart rate can go up and go down, and so on when you're angry. Lots of different things happen when you're angry. So, and also, people scowl when they're not angry, right? They scowl when they're confused. They scowl when they're concentrated. This took me a long time to learn. My husband, actually, when I first met him, he's a scowler. When he is concentrating really hard, he scowls, like a full-on facial scowl, which used to constantly make me say to him, "Why are you mad? I don't know mad. I don't like your face." And so one day I decided to talk to my graduate students about this, and I went into the lab and I said, "You know, I'm dating this guy and he scowls when he's angry. He scowls when he's concentrating there," and they all were like, "Oh, you scowl when you're concentrated." And sure enough, you know, they would be practicing their talks, and they'd be in the lab, they'd be practicing their talk, and I'd be like scowling at them. And I'm concentrating really hard on what they're saying, and they thought that I hated what they said. Which I can assure you I did not. But here's the interesting thing. Here's how frequently people infer a scowl infer anger from a scowl, and infer disgust from a nose wrinkled face and so on, in English-speaking cultures, and in cultures in large-scale cultures that have some familiarity with English or with Western civilization. Much, much higher. So what does that tell you? Well, one thing it tells me is that there's a stereotype. There's a stereotype. We believe something. We believe that people scowl in anger and smile in happiness and so on, but in fact, the evidence of what people actually do is much more complicated. And also, it turns out that when you go to other cultures that are not familiar with the Western stereotypes, you do not see evidence of those blue bars. So, in other cultures, people don't infer anger in a scowl and happiness in a smile and so on. So here are the cultures that have been studied in the last 10 years. All of them remote cultures, all of them with very little access to Western cultural practices and norms. And in these cultures, that stereotype doesn't exist. Right? So, for example, in the Trobriand Islands, the stereotypic expression for fear in our culture, which is a wide-eyed, gasping face, is actually a display of threat in that culture, or anger. So I could show you a ton more evidence, but instead I'm just going to show you an image that will sort of sum up the evidence for you in the following way. When we look at this girl's face, how does she look to you? Sad?
Tired.
Tired. Shout it out, people. Sneeze. She's about to sneeze. We all know what that means. The other things are going to look like you're about to sneeze, but that's not happening. Yeah. Anything else? Laughing? Okay. Well, this is my daughter, Sophia, from 2 years ago when we were at the Chocolate Museum in Cologne, Germany. And she is just experiencing what I can only describe to you as a profound and deep sense of pleasure. She's on her second chocolate drink. And this little sweetheart is also experiencing a profound sense of pleasure. The lesson here is that people move their faces in many different ways during the same emotion. During instances of the same emotion. And if we look at this little guy's eyebrows, he's making a set of movements that belong to the hypothesized expression for anger. This one. So when people look at this face without context, they think this guy is infuriated, really, really angry. But actually, this is Jim Webb, who in 2006 won the senatorial race in Virginia that returned the Senate to Democratic control with his victory. Now, this is Massachusetts, so I can just say that we should all take a minute and simulate that. Returning the Senate to Democratic control. I tried this in Virginia, actually, a couple of weeks ago. This was their senator. They did not laugh. But without context, though, we see this guy's face as angry because, in fact, you know, this face symbolizes anger in our culture. So people don't just move their faces in different ways during instances of the same emotion. They also move their faces in the same way during instances of different emotions. I'm not suggesting that the variation is random here. I'm just suggesting there's much more variation in what people actually do, in what you actually do, in what your friends actually do, your family actually does, than is captured by the classical view, where there is a one-to-one correspondence between an expression and an emotion. So in emotion, a face does not speak for itself. When you see emotion in another person's face, you are not reading their face. You are guessing. Your brain is guessing what the facial movements mean. And this guessing occurs automatically and effortlessly with really no awareness on your part that that's what you're doing. And even if you're someone who reads people well, who has a lot of confidence in your ability to read people, that still means that your brain is just guessing. Under the hood, your brain is guessing. And these guesses are what we use to make meaning of facial movements like the raise of an eyebrow or the curl of a lip or the tilt of the head. This is how a single movement, like a smile, takes on very, very different emotional meanings in different situations. So the punchline here is that variation is the norm when it comes to emotion. And so what's up with these expressions? So how many of you have seen these expressions in papers or textbooks or on the internet? Or how many of you take an intro psych? Then all of you have seen these faces. Because they're in, maybe not these literal faces, but these expressions appear in every published textbook, introductory textbook in psychology, as universal expressions of emotion. So where do they come from? Well, I can tell you that they were not discovered by scientists who were observing people expressing emotions in everyday life. They were stipulated by a handful of scientists and adopted as universal truth. And then we built a whole science around them. So we have a science of stereotypes when it comes to understanding the expression and perception of emotion. Or maybe, you could say like a science of emojis. So consider what this means. Walk into any daycare, any preschool, and what you see are puzzles and games and posters and books that teach children how to express and perceive emotions according to the stereotypes. Think about what it means that in every preschool around the country and in many other countries, we're teaching stereotypes to our children as if they were the real phenomena for the last 50 years. And also consider the fact that there's a growing economy of emotion reading apps and gadgets and so on, tech companies which are spending considerable amounts of money and effort to develop emotion reading devices, all based on the assumption that everyone makes and recognizes facial expressions of emotion in exactly the same way. So that you could read emotion in someone's face the way that you could read words on a page. But facial movements aren't a language that you can read. Still, there's plenty of companies that claim that they can already read emotions in people's faces. And this is not like idle. This is not an idle concern in that security services, in legal contexts, there's a push to use these face reading, expression reading devices in contexts that can influence the outcomes of people's lives. So I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that facial movements are random. I'm not saying that they carry no information. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to automatically read people's faces or at least capture their facial movements. What I'm suggesting is that the sort of official position that we see in textbooks and in movies and on Sesame Street even, that these are stereotypes. And then there's much more variation in what humans do to express and perceive emotion than if those stereotypes apply. And so there are important consequences to getting this stuff wrong in everyday life. And so it's important not to misunderstand the nature of the phenomena that we're studying. So I'm going to give you one more example of a myth about emotion. That each emotion comes with its own signature of physical changes in the body. So many textbooks and papers state that William James, the great William James, said, one of the fathers of American psychology, said that every emotion has its own physical signature, its own bodily state. William James actually meant something very deep when he said that. When William James said that every emotion has its own physical state, he meant every instance of emotion, not every category. He meant every instance of anger has its own physical state. Every instance of fear has its own physical state. In philosophy, we would say each token has its own physical state. The type, the category, is highly variable. But William James is actually cited in most textbooks as saying the opposite, as saying that each type, each category, anger, sadness, fear, as a category, has its own physical signature. And so, again, in my lab, we investigated this question, again using a meta-analysis, this time looking at 233 papers where physical changes were measured during emotional events. And what I'm showing you here are studies that involve non-clinical samples, so subjects with neurotypical brains. The effect size, or the magnitude of the association between any physical change and the instance of emotion, is displayed along the x-axis as a correlation coefficient. And the y-axis lists the measures that were used of the autonomic nervous system. So for example, here are the effect sizes for neutral inductions, when subjects were induced into a neutral state. The shape represents the average change from a resting baseline. And the larger the shape means we had more studies to summarize, more studies were available. So, oh, and I should say the wings there are the confidence interval, the 95% confidence interval. So the effect sizes across studies varied according to the width of that bar. So if the classical view is right, then the view that was illustrated so nicely in Inside Out, then what you would expect to see here is little overlap in the effect sizes or in the confidence intervals of the distributions, the wings, for each emotion category. And so here are the results. This is what we see. These are the effect sizes for anger, for fear, for disgust, for happiness, or sorry, sadness, and complete overlap. So what this means is that there is no feature, no physiological feature or set of features that are unique to any emotion category. Instead, there's tremendous overlap in the distributions of the autonomic features. So in fear, your heart rate can go up, it can go down, it can stay the same. In anger, your blood pressure can go up, it can go down, it can stay the same. It's not random, it's tied to the situation. Physiologists have known for almost 100 years now that your physiology changes, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and so on, with your action, your physical action, or with your intention to act. And even other mammals, like rats, don't do one thing in fear. In fear, sometimes they freeze, sometimes they run away, sometimes they attack, sometimes they faint. Think about all the things that you do in anger, or in sadness, or in gratitude, across the various instances of emotion in a single category. Your actions are very different, and your physiology is going to follow your actions. It's going to be linked to your actions. So emotions are not written in your body, they're actually constructed by your brain. In fact, what your brain is doing is it's attempting to make sense of what is going on inside your own body. Now, you might think that your brain would know exactly what's going on inside your own body, but actually, that's not the case. Your brain actually has to guess what's going on inside your body, because we're not wired to feel every single thing that goes on inside our own bodies. If we were, we would never pay attention to anything outside our own skin ever again. Because there's a lot going on inside your own body that you don't have access to. So here's the way it works, or just a gist, I guess, of the way it works. Your brain evolved to control your body. Your brain didn't evolve. Brains in general didn't evolve so that animals could see and think and feel. Brains evolved to control bodies. As bodies got bigger with more systems and more complexity, brains got bigger with more systems and more complexity. Your brain's business is basically budgeting the internal resources of your body. So your brain is running a budget for your body.
it's not budgeting money, it's budgeting the resources that your body uses, like salt and water and oxygen and glucose and so on, the hormones that keep you alive and well, so that you can do the most important thing from a biological standpoint that you need to do, which is to pass your genes on to the next generation. And this continuous budgeting process is largely invisible to you for the reasons that I mentioned before. You have a virtual symphony of sensations going on inside your own body, but you don't have general access to them. In fact, evolution did not give you specific access to what is going on inside your own body. If you think about vision as vision, we have a lot of detail with vision. It's very high dimensional. So if we think about it as like high definition TV, then the analogy would be that our bodies, our ability to sense our bodies more like watching a black and white television from the 1950s with really bad reception in a rainstorm. You know, if you think about it, even when something's actually going wrong with our body, like appendicitis, right? Your appendix is about to burst. You don't actually feel a pain in that spot until your appendix is ready to burst. Usually what you feel is this dull ache that's just sort of isn't anywhere in particular. You have this vague sense that something's wrong. You might occasionally feel your heartbeat when you're running up the stairs, but actually, you're actually not feeling your heartbeat. What you're feeling is the vibration of your heart against your rib cage. So you're actually feeling your rib cage vibrating, not actually you're feeling your heart. You can't actually feel your heart until something goes drastically wrong, as in someone is about to have a heart attack. Right? That's when you can feel what's happening. So mostly, what we need to do in order to figure out what's going on inside our bodies is use kind of a workaround. And evolution gave you a workaround that sort of hints at the state of your body budget, whether it's generally imbalanced or whether it's in the red. And colloquially we call this mood, and scientists call this affect. So affect is our physical properties, the properties of physical feelings like comfort, discomfort, pleasantness, unpleasantness, feeling very calm and tranquil, feeling really jittery and aroused or alert, agitation. Affect is always with you every waking moment of your life, whether you're emotional or not, and whether you're aware of it or not. It's a quick summary of what's going on inside your own body, kind of like a barometer without too much detail. And your brain has to link these simple feelings, which are always with you, has to link them to what's going on around you in order to figure out what to do about them. And the result is sometimes an emotion, but not always. And I should point out that this is not something that you are doing consciously and deliberately most of the time. Most of the time it's just something that your brain is doing very automatically. It's trying to make sense of what's going on inside your own body in relation to what's going on around you outside in the world. So this is how, you know, a dull ache in your body could be hunger if, you know, it's 5:30, 5:45, and you're stuck sitting in a lecture listening to someone natter on instead of getting to eat your dinner. It could also be anxiety. Exactly the same dull ache, your brain can transform into a feeling of anxiety if, for example, you're in a doctor's office waiting to get test results, or if you are in an exam room right before you have to take an exam in class. And that same dull ache, if you're a judge in a courtroom, might be your brain might, if you're a judge in a courtroom or you're a juror in a courtroom, your brain might transform this into a gut feeling that the defendant can't be trusted and so should be sent to prison. If you're taking an exam, you would be in school, like here, you would be advised to turn this ache in your gut into a feeling of determination, to get your butterflies flying in formation, because studies show that doing this won't reduce those arousal, jittery feelings, and you don't want that to happen, but it will actually increase your likelihood of doing well and performing well on your exam. So emotions are not your reactions to the world. They are actually your constructions of the world, or more precisely, they are your brain's understanding of what is going on inside your own body in relation to what is happening in the world. Categorizing what's going on in your body like an ache in relation to what's happening in the world, so that your brain can figure out what you need to do next in order to keep your body budget in solvent and in balance. So consider various instances of when you're happy. So here are some instances that make me happy. Walking in the woods, or lying on the beach, or baking a cake for my family, or doing yoga, or gossiping with a friend, or gardening in my backyard. The emotion category is the same. The instances are the same, but the physical actions are different, and therefore the experience of the emotion, even though it's the same category, is different, because what's going on inside my own body is different in each of these cases, and my brain is making sense of it as happiness. So in a sense, William James was right. William James, what he actually said was right, but that's very different from how textbooks quote him, which is actually incorrect. Now, I could give you, I could go on and give you an example from brain imaging and from the work on single cell recordings of neurons in the brain and brain lesion work, showing you exactly the same thing, that there's not one circuit for anger, there's not one network for anger, there's not one pattern distributed across the brain that indicates anger or any emotion category. Again, its variation is the norm, situated variation. But instead, I want to close with an example that I hope will kind of give you an intuition for what I'm suggesting here. And here's the example. So when you look at this, how many of you see like blobby black and white images here? And how many of you see an object? Mm-hmm. What do you see?
It's a bee.
It's a bee. And how do you know it's a bee?
I just see it as a bee.
Okay, have you seen this image before?
Yeah, it's in the book.
It's in the book? This image is not in the book.
There's like one similar to it in the book, which is also a bee.
That's true. Anybody else see a bee? Okay, well normally when I ask this, before I ask this, I say to people, anyone who's seen this before, don't answer this question. Who sees this? What do you see here? And people say all kinds of things. A lobster, a superhero, a duck. One woman saw a Louisiana swamp in this image. So what's really happening is that when your brain encounters something like this, it's billions of neurons in the brain are trying to guess, searching through a lifetime of past experiences, trying to guess what this is. And it's trying on possibilities, weighing probabilities, trying to answer the question, what is this most like? What is this most like from my past experience? Not what is this? What is this most like? What is this most similar to? And it's all happening in the blink of an eye. It took a shorter amount of time for it to happen than it did for me to explain this. Now so really what your brain is doing when it looks at something like this is it's trying to create a concept. Because it's asking the question, what is this most similar to in my past experience? Things that are similar to each other in some way are a category. And a mental representation of a category is a concept. So your brain, whenever it encounters sensory inputs, is trying to create a category, a concept, so that it can make sense of the sensory inputs that it encounters. If it can't create a concept or a category, then what you encounter, you experience as noise, visual noise in this case, or auditory noise in the case where you're listening to language that you can't make sense of, for example. And in psychology, we call this experiential blindness. And so now I'm going to cure you of your experiential blindness. And in fact, it is me. You know, I have another version of this where I use a snake, but it's I did that on a TED Talk, which almost 3 million people have now seen, and so I can't use it anymore. And these images are super hard to make, actually. So, how many of you now see a bee? Yeah. No, I see a couple of shaking their heads, so that's right. So now, your brain is faced with exactly the same sensory inputs as it was before. But when your brain searches through its past experience, it finds something new knowledge there, the knowledge from the color photograph of the bee. And that changes your experience of these blobs. So your brain is doing perceptual inference. It's inferring sensory features that aren't actually there so that you can see a bee that actually isn't there. So this is a sort of a hallucination. And this kind of hallucination is not the sort of hallucination that leads you running to the hospital to be checked out. This kind of a hallucination, or what the philosopher Andy Clark calls a controlled hallucination, is business as usual for your brain. This is how you experience every experience that you have. This is how it's constructed. And this is how every action that you take is controlled. The concepts that your brain makes using past experience are crucial ingredients to what you see and hear and feel and how you move. And the reason why you see lines where there are no lines, to see a bee where there is no bee, is that your brain is doing something absolutely remarkable, which is it's changing the firing of its own neurons based on past experience. And that allows you to have a perceptual experience of something that actually isn't there. Now, if I were to show you the actual bee, what your brain would do is compare it to its simulation. It's changed its own firing of its own neurons, and that's what. And then it updates. It either goes with that perception or it updates that perception. So that's why you see color here, whereas you don't see it here. So how many of you have ever had a song going through your head that you cannot get rid of at all? No. That is exactly the same thing. Your brain is basically making perceptual inference. You're changing the firing of the neurons in your auditory cortex, so you sort of hear the ghost of a song that isn't there. And if the song then started to play, it would either confirm the neural firing that's already in your head, or it might change that neural firing if, for example, there's some note that you hadn't heard before. All of a sudden arose. Now I can tell you, in the book I talk about how, this happens to us all the time. In my house, we talk about, controlled hallucinations and correcting our predictions, as these are called, simulations, with the errors of prediction that happen to us sometimes, where we are expecting something, a sensory input to happen, and it doesn't quite happen the way we expect. So, for example, when my daughter, who's a drummer, she's a heavy metal drummer, when she started to listen to dubstep, to me, it just sounded like noise. Seriously. How many of you here like that? Wow, it sounds like noise. Okay, just fine. But here's the thing. We're in this moment. This is a heavy metal band. How many of you know in this moment? Wow, seriously? It's really good, I can say now. But at the beginning, I didn't really feel that way. So I found it really interesting. So I think how many of you have ever learned a language that you didn't know before? And my guess is that for most of you, at first it was hard to know where the beginnings of words started and the ends of words ended, because you couldn't even parse those sounds into words. You didn't even have a concept for the word, what a word was in that language. And then eventually you could hear the sounds, but you'd have to really kind of deliberately guess at what it meant. But eventually, you didn't have to. Eventually, it just kind of came to you automatically. And that's because even something as simple as speaking and understanding a language, or as difficult as speaking and understanding a language, is based on this kind of controlled illusion, hallucination that we engage in all the time. Right now, to you, it seems as if you're just sitting, listening to me speak, but in fact, your brains are predicting, and you're changing the firing of your own neurons so that you can hear and understand every single word that comes out of my mouth. And imagine how surprised you would have been if I had said some other words. That deserved a laugh. You guys are getting really tired, so I'm going to stop and I'm going to take questions. Questions? Yes.
So I think the concept that most people have is more about the color of the piece. And I think this is more about the shape of the piece here. And so we think there was like, say, I know you can do something like that, but what if you do something that like the shape is more known to you? Bring up the concept of the color?
You know, this works with cows and dogs, so these are called Mooney illusions. They have them for a Dalmatian, dog, or cows. So I've used a cow in a different something. We've made a bunch of these. So I made this one actually, and I made the one in the book. I've used them for snakes, for all kinds of for rabbits, for all kinds of animals or scenes. Basically, certainly color is possible. You can also do it with. Couldn't really do it with color. It works better with shape. To give the example, you can also use the acoustical sound. So you can take, like, how many of you have ever? This is online, for example. Listen to Led Zeppelin, "Stairway to Heaven" backwards. You can't really hear anything until someone puts the words up on the screen, just like slightly before, and then it sounds exactly like devil worship. So my point is that you can take any random sensory input and give it a little bit of structure, and then take that, show the structure, take the structure away. People can then impose the structure because they've encoded it. They've taken in what we would call a prediction error, information they didn't have. They couldn't predict, they didn't have. But then they take it in and then they can use it to structure the image. And so this is just a contrived image to make a point, right? That actually the visual inputs that come in through the retina, the acoustical inputs that come in, the variations in sound pressure through the cochlea and so on, are continuous, noisy, and we make sense of them. And we make sense of them using our past experience. Now, you may never have experienced a bee in that position, in this exact location, that size, but your brain can take past examples of bees, past instances of bees, and combine those instances in new ways to allow you to see a bee where there is a bee. That's basically called conceptual combination in the cognitive science literature, and that's what our brains do. That's what allows us to be creative. That's what allows you to recognize a face as a face, even if you've never seen that face before in your life. Yeah. Other questions?
We recognize their essential standards, but would the same thing be applied to like other animals that they were very distinct things or like movements or ways that cats
So the question is, our facial, the sort of the scowls and smiles and frowns may be stereotypes, but is it also true? What about, the sounds that a cat makes when it's in various states of emotion, or is that a stereotype? There are a number of assumptions that you're making just even in the way that you ask that question that make it impossible to answer it quickly. So let me just say this, that you can take any animal, like take a baby, for example, human baby. A human baby, people believe, actually some parents still believe that they can, in a baby's cry, that the babies cry one way when they're tired, and they cry with a different acoustical signature when they're frustrated, and they cry with a different acoustical signature when they're hungry, and so on and so forth. That's been shown again and again and again to be absolutely false. A baby's cry, the acoustics of the cry indicate something about the intensity of the distress. But what parents do, what caregivers do, is they make sense of what that cry means in the context. If you strip away the context, there's no information other than the affective information of the intensity of distress. So when you're looking at the acoustical signatures of other calls, there's some evidence that animals like certain primates have specific calls for certain kinds of predators, like a predator in the air versus a predator on the ground versus a predator in a tree, right? So, you know, an owl versus a snake versus a cat, like a big cat or something. But there's no evidence that the acoustics say anything about an emotional state. And some people, some scientists aren't sure that that animals have emotions like human emotions. Which doesn't mean that they don't have affect. They certainly feel pleasure and pain, and they certainly feel affiliation, and they have dominance and those kinds of things. And they may be able to make concepts that allow them to have emotions that we don't have. Like dogs can perceive much more olfaction, a range of olfaction than we can. So the question of whether or not there are specific sensory cues for specific emotional states in animals is a somewhat fraught question in the sense that it's not really clear that non-human animals have human-like emotions. They certainly have sentiment and feelings, like affect. They have bodies, their brains regulate their bodies just like our brains regulate ours. But they may experience, they may make those into experiences that we have no direct access to. We're using our own concepts to make sense of their cries and so on. And so from that perspective, we're doing, our brains do with their acoustics what our brains do with babies' acoustics. And frankly, what your brain is doing right now when it is hearing the acoustics of my voice, right? Your brain is making you guess, was she annoyed? Is she, it's a funny question? Is she, I just thought it was a great question. So animal brains are doing what our brains do too, but the content of what they can, the concepts they can make are sometimes very different. Yeah. What prompted me to research the construction of emotion? When I was a graduate student, I didn't study emotion. I was actually studying self-representation of self. That's what I was more interested in. But I had to measure emotion for my dissertation, and I measured. So I tried to replicate a study that had been published in the literature, and I couldn't do it. And so I tried again. I couldn't do it. I tried 8 times. 8 times. I had 8 experiments, failed to replicate what was published in the literature. And so my assumption, reasonably, was that I was completely not cut out to be a scientist, and I should just give it up and do something else. But when I stopped feeling sorry for myself and I actually just looked at the data, I realized that the problem was that the measures of emotion were not functioning the way that they were supposed to. That people seem to be, the test subjects in my studies seem to be reporting that they felt, when they felt anxious, they also felt depressed. When they felt depressed, they also felt anxious.
So they were reporting all or none. And the replication depended on the ability of subjects to say they felt one or the other. So I thought, well, the problem here is that subjects just can't tell how they feel. They don't have an awareness of their states. And so really what I need to do is I need to find an objective measure of their emotional states that I don't have to ask them about. So we would say a perceiver-independent measurement. And then I would know exactly how they felt, and I wouldn't have to ask them. And maybe I could also use that measure to teach them to be more aware of their states. So I thought, well, everybody knows that, you know, if there's one facial expression for each emotion. Darwin said so, and therefore it must be true because, you know, Darwin can't be wrong. Darwin can be wrong. Darwin was wrong in this case. And in fact, it's something I talk about in my book, that Darwin actually contradicted himself. So the things that Darwin was most right about are also applied to the science of emotion, but he ignored his own big insights when he wrote his classic book on the expression of the emotion of animals. But anyways, Darwin said it must be right, so I went to the literature, I looked at the literature, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, everyone keeps saying that there's, you know, these expressions are universal, but there's actually a lot of evidence for variability. And in the lab, you see that evidence tremendously. And I thought, okay, well, William James said that, you know, there's one bodily signature for each category of emotion, so that must be true. I'm going to just learn, I'm going to become a physiologist, I'm going to learn that. I'll figure it out, and in a couple of months, I'll just be able to go back to my work. And, but it turns out William James didn't say that. And also the data from the literature are, as I showed you. It's not like that meta-analysis that I showed you of those 223 studies, that's a brand new finding. That finding has been known. That was just the latest version of that finding. That finding has been known for decades, really, but ignored. And then eventually I thought, okay, well, you know, at first I thought, I'll just figure out this objective measurement thing in a couple of months and then I'll go back to my dissertation. And, you know, 25 years later, here I am. So basically what I did was I just systematically went one measurement domain after another. There are these claims that persist, despite the evidence, which kind of got me interested in two questions. One was, so what the hell is going on? Like, what actually is going on inside our brains and our bodies when emotions happen? Because it's clearly not the classical view that you're born with a set of neurons that are dedicated to fear, and every mammal on this planet has the same set, and it just triggers, and then, or maybe you evaluate things in a certain way, and then it triggers, and then you get this very characteristic suite of observations in the face and in the body and in the rest of the brain. It's just, the data don't support that. So I just kind of got interested to answer the question of like, what is happening? And I also got interested in the question of why is it that there are, at this point, thousands of experiments which don't support that hypothesis, but yet people still believe it, and scientists still write about it. In every science, in physics, in chemistry, in biology, in every science, the science begins with subjective. Explanations for phenomena are from our subjective experience. It's a very classical view. What did Aristotle say were the elements of the universe? Air, water, fire, earth. Now what do we know to be the elements of the universe? Little strings that vibrate in 11 dimensions, or 13 dimensions. Right? When you read quantum mechanics, somebody in who studies quantum mechanics won't tell you that electrons exist in the world, in the universe. They will say, what we describe as an electron exists when we measure it in a certain way. So there's something that exists that we describe as an electron when it's measured in a particular way. It's a very constructionist view. Darwin, what was Darwin's big insight? Darwin's big insight was actually that, again, that
there isn't an essence for every living creature on the planet. That instead, variability in a species is the norm. You know, you take like all the Cocker Spaniels, some of them have short tails, some have long tails, some have big coats, some have thinner coats. You take Darwin's finches, they vary in their beak size and their depthness, and so on and so forth. That variability is meaningful. Darwin basically wrenched biology away from this very classical view towards a much more constructionist view. So in every science process is a slow, plodding, march away from these kind of naive realism explanations of the world to something that's much more emergent and constructionist. And so I also think that's what's happening here. Not just for motion, actually, but for every mental event that you experience, every action that you take, it's kind of built that way. That is the short story of my journey, and I think we're probably at time, right? So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.